Hello and welcome everybody to this update on 18th of June 2022 on the Russo-Ukrainian war. I haven't made any updates over the last couple of weeks because the situation on the ground was incredibly difficult to really analyze, but over the last couple of days events have clarified a lot of things, and what we can state right now, what it seems to be going on the ground, is that the Russians are gaining ground in the Donbas region. They have just taken and threatened a major supply line for the Ukrainian forces in this pocket near Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. But on the other hand, there is heavy Ukrainian resistance not only in that pocket but all over Ukraine, which has so far thwarted major Russian advances, basically thwarting and grinding to halt any kind of offensive that the Russians may be capable of at this moment in time. And we now can confirm that there are significant Russian losses in the Donbas region especially. So what basically seems to happen, according to Tony Radakin, the Chief of Defense Staff of the United Kingdom, Russian losses are at about 25% of equipment, personnel and so on, which is absolutely unsustainable in any kind of fashion, leading to Radakin saying that despite slow advances of the Russians, these advantages have been so costly that he stated just today that the Russians have strategically lost this war. So in summary, what seems to be happening is that the Ukrainians are trading ground for time, essentially copying the strategy that NATO forces in Germany wanted or were looking to employ if the Warsaw Pact was ever launching an offensive into Western Germany. And it seems to be working very, very well for the Ukrainians so far. And the Russian response is basically random attacks, missile strikes all over Ukraine, terrorizing civilians while they can't really get any gains in the Donbas region. And wherever they are making gains, they are losing so much in equipment and personnel that these gains are essentially worthless compared to what the Russians are losing. So President Zelensky just recently said one of his next aims is to liberate Crimea, and looking at how the war is going, this could mean that the attempt is becoming increasingly possible, that the Ukrainians are going to launch more and more offensives towards both Crimea as well as the northeastern flank of the Russian border, where the Russians are barely holding their own and barely holding the Ukrainians back from pushing towards the border. In many places, the Ukrainians already are at the border and could enter the Russian territory and attack Russian territory at any moment in time. But that doesn't seem to be any kind of objective for the Ukrainians. Another possibility is obviously that the mere threat of a potential Ukrainian offensive to dislodge Russian troops from Crimea, which has been occupied since 2014, would make the Russians negotiate a peace with Ukraine. So what seems to be happening, and commentators have stated that the recent encouragement to submit a bid for the Ukrainians to become a European Union member is ruling out any kind of territorial concessions to the Russians. So in reality, while the EU is stating that there would be no threat to European Union territory, in reality President Zelensky has several times made it clear that after 3 months of war and more by now, Ukraine would need to be ready to make some form of concessions to the Russians in order to avoid further destruction of Ukrainian territory, Ukrainian assets, and of course stop the horrendous losses both armies are taking. What we need to bear in mind is that Western weapon deliveries will only be effective in 4 to 10 weeks. This is the timeline where more and more weapons will start to arrive in Ukraine and enabling the defenders to actually use them effectively against the Russian army. And one of the comments I have been getting all over the place is, well, but why are Western powers, the Americans, the Germans, and so on, sending old, useless equipment that the Russians are losing in the war with Ukraine? Why don't we send new weapons, new equipment to better counter the Russians? And the reason for that is very simple. The Ukrainians are not trained on these weapon systems. They are trained on, for example, T-72 tanks, and not Leopard 2 or M1 Abrams tanks, which would definitely be more effective in a ground war. But without a trained and motivated crew, these weapon systems would essentially be useless, and it would take a lot of time to train Ukrainian soldiers on these new systems. So what really would help right now is equipment that the Ukrainians can immediately use. And while it takes months, if not years, to properly train on a battle tank, it is much easier to train someone to use a rifle or to use a self-propelled artillery gun. So those are the things that we need to bear in mind when we hear news that the Ukrainians are receiving equipment like T-72s and BMP-1 APCs. Old stuff is more useful right now, but as the conflict protracts and goes further and further on into the future, which hopefully it won't, new equipment that the Ukrainians have been promised and that the Ukrainians are actively pursuing will be of more use to finally move the Russians out of Ukrainian territory. And there is a real danger right now, if this conflict is slowing down, it would, on a positive side, prevent the horrendous losses both armies must be taking right now. And the recent release of the Ukrainian defense staff of their losses is an attest to that this war has taken a heavy toll on both sides. So what we would not want to see is a war that protracts for an indefinite time, where occasional advances by both sides are basically countering each other out, and where losses on a daily basis are low but still mount up over time to the horrendous losses we have been seeing for the last weeks and months. So one of the things that tells us that the Ukrainian defense is highly effective is that the Russians started deploying 50 to 60-year-old tanks like the T-72 and T-64s. It shows that the Russians are increasingly reluctant to sacrifice more modern equipment for the marginal gains they have been making. And that is no small part due to the Ukrainians being very effective in their tactics to delay and use these little pinpricks and these salami slicing tactics against the Russians to grind them down. Obviously, the support and the recent encouragement to submit a bid for EU membership is driving morale on the ground for the Ukrainians all the way up, and it will be difficult to find a balance and possibly restrain highly motivated Ukrainian forces and stopping them from starting an offensive that they can't really follow through on at this moment in time. So what seems to be crucial right now is that the Ukrainians need time, which means we need to continue supporting them on all possible occasions with supplies, with weapons, with things that boost their morale. And at the same time, we need to continue our efforts to help Ukraine defend itself. And bear in mind that a number of Ukrainian troops is abroad right now training on old and new weapon systems to gain that experience that they need to effectively use this material on the battlefield and push the Russians out of their territory. Thank you very much and see you soon.